A university and a graduate theological seminary is unapologetically an academic institution. Those who teach in such a place as this are scholars. They work to foster an intellectual engagement with a variety of disciplines. Within a Christian environment, this is anchored within the Christian intellectual and spiritual tradition, learning to think Christianly in a way that is consistent with the ancient faith and in a manner that informs life and work and relationships. We cultivate a Christian mind. We learn what it means to think critically, confidently, creatively, and compassionately. If there is one word that captures all of this, regardless of whether we are business students or education students, regardless of major, biology, sociology, or music, whether a grad of the university or a grad of the seminary, whether you are called into service in the church or in the world, that one word is wisdom. Nothing quite crystallizes our resolve as this, that a student at Ambrose University or a student at Ambrose Seminary will grow in wisdom, or more accurately, will grow in the capacity for wisdom, since wisdom is a lifelong pursuit and journey. Few biblical passages capture this quite so eloquently as the text that has just been read for us from Proverbs chapter 4, most notably verses 5 through 7. Hear them again. Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. And whatever else you get insight. Resolve that in your senior years, and by that I mean not your third and fourth year here, but rather when you are older, that when you are older, you will not be an old fool, but rather that the longer you live, the wiser you will become. You will grow in wisdom, in insight, and wisdom, bless her, will guard you. This is our vision and resolve as a university and seminary, that if you study here, you're part of a community that has this objective unapologetically so: to hear the call to wisdom and to give ourselves enthusiastically to this end. Thus, we study and we learn. We know that there is no wisdom without knowledge, and that there's no knowledge without teaching. And thus, we are a teaching, learning community. I get all this. I live in this. I take great joy and delight to be part of an academic community that has this vision and this resolve. This is what brings me to work every day. And yet, there's one verse in Proverbs chapter 4 that jumps out at me again and again. The whole of the chapter is a call to wisdom, but we must not miss verse 23, which reads, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flows the springs of life." Actually, the most common phrase that is used to translate the original here, most translations have some variation of "guard your heart." It implies that you tend to your heart, that you are attentive to the health and well-being of your interior life, the movements of your heart, or in more ancient language, the affections, the interior desires, the longings, the emotional tenor and movements of joy and sorrow, or in the language of one tradition, consolation and desolation. There's no doubt that this verse jumps out at me in part because the entire Christian intellectual tradition and spiritual tradition affirms the priority of our interior lives, the movements of the heart. All the way back to the early church, including that intellectual giant, Augustine of Hippo, and his line from the Confessions that reverberates down through history and the church, his confession that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. My current reading and research focus on the doctrine of the ascension, the creedal affirmation that we make that Christ is not only crucified and risen, but also ascended to the right hand of God and is now our high priest and the Lord of the cosmos and the Lord of the church. And my reading necessarily means that I tend to those ancient voices, early church voices that testify to the ascension. And it has me reading the sermons of the person I just mentioned, St. Augustine, nicely collected for us in Augustine's sermons on the ascension, Actually, it's all part of a collection of his sermons over the entire liturgical year, from Advent to Lent to Good Friday to Easter Sunday and all the way up to Pentecost and beyond. And you can find his sermons collected for you, presumably over many years, on Ascension Sunday. Reading these sermons is something I have found actually rather entertaining at several points. For example, when he goes on and on and on at some length about why Jesus spent 40 days on the earth after the resurrection prior to the ascension. Why 40 days? And he speculates on a variety of potential reasons for this. And he has a number of asides that would probably not be endorsed by our current professor of preaching at Ambrose Seminary, who would probably say to him, "Get on with it, why are you doing a rabbit trail?" One of those rabbit trails was about death. He speaks forthrightly about death, noting that many are ready to die, and that indeed he is ready to die. And then he adds that he's ready to die, and then this line, "I would like to die," he writes or preaches, "in my bed, surrounded by my children, my grandchildren, and my grief-stricken wife." My grief-stricken wife, indeed. I read this section of the sermon to Joella, my wife, to alert her to how the church fathers would counsel her when that time comes for us. But it is something else that Augustine mentions, seemingly in passing, that is pertinent to what I'm speaking to here this morning. He notes that we are in fellowship with the ascended Christ even as we lift up our hearts to him. No surprise there. You would expect him to say this, and no surprise that he quotes from the Gospel of Matthew, "Blessed are the clean in heart." And he has more to say on the topic, more on the call to prayer, expanding specifically on the call to lift up your heart to the Lord. And then, seemingly as he writes, out of nowhere, he says this, "Be quick to forgive the sins committed against you. Let no one nourish anger against another, lest he obstruct his own prayer to God." All of this is in the context of guard your heart and the call to lift up your heart to the Lord. Yes, this is an academic institution. We are a school, a vital center of teaching and learning and the cultivation of and the engagement of a thoughtful Christian faith. We believe that we make disciples by the renewal of the mind. Foundational to what we do is we lean into the teaching of scholars and intellectuals, thoughtful women and men who are the faculty of this university. They take sabbaticals to do research that in turn informs their teaching and their capacity to foster within us knowledge that leads to wisdom and our capacity to grow in wisdom. And yet, all of this is for naught if we do not learn to guard our hearts and tend to the interior movements of joy and sorrow and consolation and desolation. If we do not guard our hearts, we will not be able to think deeply and clearly. And so we are part of a Christian community where we are learning to love one another and forgive one another, even as we learn to worship and play together. We will learn, in the words of the book of James, to be slow to anger and quick to listen and receive the word of God with meekness given by the Spirit. If we have experienced significant trauma and wrong along the way, our university and seminary years will include attention to the internal, emotional, and mental well-being. We cannot afford to be naive about the power of trauma, and the university and seminary years give us a window of opportunity with friends, counselors, chaplains to walk with us and help us make sense of what has happened as we move towards healing, wholeness, and reconciliation. Our shared worship, week in and week out. Join us for chapel twice a week, every Tuesday and every Thursday, and it will call forth and cultivate within us a longing for the good, the noble, and the excellent, the ordering of our affections, as we, in the words of the Epistle to the Ephesians, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in our hearts to God. But most of all, dear friends, we will be quick to forgive. We will hear the exhortation of the Church Father to not let anger, to not let resentment settle into our hearts. In other words, Our vision is to pursue wisdom, but our wisdom is one that grows out of our capacity or includes our capacity for joy and the fundamental interior orientation of our hearts. This interior capacity, I repeat, is essential to our call to study and to learn, for we cannot think clearly unless we learn to guard our hearts. My prayer is that even if you do not use that specific phrase, guard your heart, that you will complete your studies here at Ambrose University and at Ambrose Seminary, and that there will be a distinct sense that as a student at this institution, you have learned something about what it means to guard your heart, so that whatever else you get from this place and beyond this place, in the language of Proverbs chapter 4, you will get insight, you will get wisdom, and she will guard you. Thanks be to God.